Margaret Chen's hands shook as she traced the rim of her coffee cup, the ceramic still warm against her weathered fingertips. Across from her, investigative journalist David Park leaned forward, his digital recorder capturing every whispered word in the nearly empty diner. Outside, the October wind rattled the windows. 29 years to the day since Roosevelt High's most infamous mystery began. "I need you to understand something before I tell you what really happened," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. Those 15 children weren't criminals. They were casualties of a war nobody wanted to acknowledge, a war against the forgotten, the broken, the inconvenient. She pulled a manila envelope from her purse, its contents shifting like old bones. Inside were photographs, documents, and letters, evidence of a secret she'd carried alone for 3 decades. The official story is a lie. They didn't run away together. They didn't vanish into thin air. Her eyes met his, and he saw decades of guilt and love warring behind her glasses. "I made them disappear, and I do it again." October 13th, 1995, Roosevelt High School, 3:30 p.m. The detention room smelled of chalk dust and teenage desperation. Margaret had reluctantly accepted the assignment when Mrs. Hendricks called in sick, her 3rd sick day that month, though everyone knew she was avoiding the increasingly violent incidents plaguing the school. 15 students occupied the scarred wooden desks, each carrying invisible wounds that bled into their behavior. Margaret recognized the signs from her own childhood. In foster care, the defensive postures, the hollow eyes, the carefully constructed walls that kept the world at bay. Danny Reeves sat in the back corner, his usual class clown mask slipping to reveal bruises along his jawline. At 17, he was already 6'2", but hunched his shoulders like a much smaller boy trying to disappear. His father, a prominent local businessman, had a reputation for old-fashioned discipline that the community chose to overlook. Sarah Kim occupied the front row, her perfect posture belying the fresh cuts hidden beneath her long sleeves. The daughter of Korean immigrants, she carried the crushing weight of being the family's hope for the American dream. A single B+ had landed her in detention after her mother discovered she'd been wasting time, tutoring struggling classmates instead of studying. Marcus Williams stared out the window, his brilliant mind trapped behind the label of troubled youth. His juvenile record, the result of stealing food for his younger siblings while their mother battled addiction, would follow him forever, destroying any chance of the medical career he dreamed about. Amy Torres, barely 14, absently rubbed her still flat stomach where new life grew. Her parents had thrown her out when they discovered her pregnancy, choosing family reputation over their daughter's survival. She'd been sleeping in her rusted Honda Civic for 2 weeks. "Mrs. Chen?" Danny's voice cut through the oppressive silence. "My dad's gonna kill me if I'm late getting home. Can we just, I don't know, talk or something? Make this go faster?" Margaret looked up from her book. To Kill a Mockingbird, chosen with unconscious irony. She'd intended to maintain strict silence following the school's zero-tolerance detention policy. But something in Danny's voice, a desperate plea for human connection, made her close the novel. "What would you like to talk about?" The question opened a floodgate, none of them expected. Danny spoke first, his words tumbling out in a rush. "You ever feel like you're drowning, but everyone thinks you're swimming? Like my dad? He doesn't mean to hurt me, that's what I tell myself, but when he gets angry..." He touched his jaw unconsciously. "I tried to tell my mum once, but she said I was being dramatic. Said I should be grateful he cares enough to discipline me." Sarah's perfectionist facade cracked. At least your parents notice when you're hurting. Mine only see results, test scores, college applications. The perfect daughter they can brag about to their friends. Sometimes I cut myself just to feel something that's mine. You know, something they can't grade or improve. Marcus laughed bitterly. You think you got problems? I'm 17 with a record that means I'll never see the inside of a college, let alone medical school. Doesn't matter that I was trying to keep my baby sisters from starving. All anyone sees is juvenile delinquent. Amy wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I'm pregnant, homeless, and 14. My parents chose their reputation over their daughter. So yeah, I think I win the "My life sucks" contest. One by one, the other students shared their stories. Jessica Martinez revealed years of sexual abuse by her stepfather, silenced by her mother's refusal to believe her. The twins, Tommy and Tyler Henderson, described living with drug-addicted parents who used them to run product. Kevin O'Brien spoke of the constant bullying that had driven him to attempt suicide twice. Lisa Park confessed to selling herself to buy food and medicine for her disabled grandmother. Each revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. These weren't the hardened criminals the faculty made them out to be. They were children screaming silently for help in a world that had stopped listening. You know what's really messed up, Sarah said, her voice hollow with exhaustion. Everyone expects us to fail. Teachers, parents, the whole town. We're already ghosts to them, invisible unless we're causing problems. Maybe we should just disappear for real, Marcus muttered. Make it official. At least then we'd have some control over it. The words hung in the air like a prophecy. 4:15 p.m., the principal's office. Principal Morrison's voice crackled over the ancient intercom system. Mrs. Chen, please escort the detention students to the main office immediately. We have several urgent matters to address. Margaret's blood turned to ice water. She'd overheard the hushed conversations in the faculty lounge that morning, seen the police cars in the parking lot, noticed the social workers consulting clipboards by the entrance. The system was closing in on her students like a pack of wolves surrounding wounded prey. Mrs. Chen, did you hear me? She pressed the intercom button with a trembling finger. Yes, Mr. Morrison. We'll be right there. But as she turned to face the 15 pairs of eyes looking at her with growing terror, Margaret saw her own childhood reflected back at her. She remembered the social worker who'd promised her new foster family would be different, better, safer. She remembered the lies, the broken promises, the systematic destruction of hope. Amy stood up slowly, her hand protectively covering her stomach. Mrs. Chen, I can't go out there. Child Protective Services called my aunt. They're going to take me away, put me in some home where they'll force me to give up my baby. They got a DNA match on that robbery, Marcus said flatly. My court-appointed lawyer says I'm looking at adult charges, says I should take a plea deal, do 5 years. Minimum. Danny's laugh was bitter and broken. My dad's lawyer called the school. Apparently, someone reported the bruises. Dad's threatening to sue for defamation. Says he'll make sure I know what real discipline looks like when this blows over. Margaret watched 15 futures being destroyed in real time. These children had trusted her with their deepest pain, and now she was supposed to deliver them to the very system that had failed them so completely. The intercom crackled again, impatient. Mrs. Chen. She looked at the open windows, at the fire escape that led to the parking lot, at the faces of children who'd never had a real chance. In that moment, Margaret Chen, the rule-following substitute teacher who'd spent 40 years trusting the system, died. "Run," she whispered. "What?" Sarah's eyes widened. "I said run, all of you, now." 4:23 p.m. The Great Deception. Margaret walked to the intercom with steady steps, her mind crystal clear for the first time in years. "Mr. Morrison, the detention room is empty." "Excuse me?" "The students are gone, all of them. I stepped out to use the restroom, and when I returned—" She let her voice break, convincingly. "The windows were open. They must have used the fire escape." Chaos erupted within minutes. Police cars screamed into the parking lot, their sirens cutting through the October air. Parents arrived in various states of panic and rage. Reporters materialized like vultures, sensing blood in the water. Margaret played her part perfectly, the shocked, overwhelmed substitute teacher who'd lost control of her charges. She answered the same questions dozens of times, her story never wavering. Brief bathroom break, empty room, open windows, vanished children. But late that night, alone in her modest apartment, Margaret made 15 phone calls that would change everything. "Danny, it's Mrs. Chen. Listen very carefully and don't hang up." The network. What the investigators never discovered was Margaret's secret network, a carefully cultivated web of connections built over decades of quiet activism. Former foster children who'd aged out of the system and become social workers, therapists, advocates, and Underground Railroad coordinators. People who understood that sometimes salvation required breaking the law. Margaret had been preparing for months, liquidating her retirement savings, selling her mother's jewelry, cashing in insurance policies. She'd identified safe houses, researched identity fabrication, studied the gaps in the system that could swallow 15 teenagers without a trace. Rachel Morrison, no relation to the principal, ran a non-profit in Portland that specialized in helping runaway teens. She'd been one of Margaret's first foster placements 30 years earlier, a scared 11-year-old who'd grown into a fierce advocate for the forgotten. "Margaret, what you're asking—" Rachel's voice was tight, with concern during their clandestine meeting weeks before the detention incident. "This is kidnapping, conspiracy. We could go to prison." "What's the alternative?" Margaret had asked. "Let them be destroyed by a system that's already failed them. Watch them become statistics, suicide, overdose, incarceration, abuse." Now, with 15 desperate children scattered across 3 states, the network activated with military precision. Danny became David Thompson, placed with a family in Eugene, Oregon, former teachers who specialized in healing trauma through art therapy and unconditional love. His new parents, both survivors of domestic violence, recognized the signs of abuse and began the slow process of teaching him that violence wasn't normal, that he deserved safety and love. Sarah transformed into Emma Wilson, enrolled in a progressive boarding school in Vermont, where academic excellence was balanced with emotional well-being. For the first time in her life, she was encouraged to pursue her own interests, rather than her parents' expectations. She discovered a passion for medicine, but pediatric surgery, helping children like she had been. Marcus became Michael Rodriguez, his juvenile record wiped clean through carefully forged documents. A family in Denver, headed by a retired doctor and his wife, a former social worker, recognized his brilliance and nurtured his dreams. Within 2 years, he was excelling in advanced placement courses and volunteer work at free clinics. Amy was transformed into Anna Garcia, placed with a young couple in New Mexico who'd struggled with infertility. They embraced both her and her unborn child, providing the love and stability she'd never known. Her daughter, Isabella, would grow up believing her adoptive grandparents were her biological family, a lie that protected them both. Each placement was carefully chosen, meticulously planned, lovingly executed. Margaret didn't just give them new names. She gave them new chances, new families, new futures. The investigation. The official investigation lasted 6 months and concluded what the authorities had predetermined from the beginning. Mass runaway incident involving troubled teens and their negligent supervisor. The case was officially closed, though it remained the subject of local legend and true crime podcasts. Detective Ray Sullivan, a good man trapped in a broken system, suspected there was more to the story. He'd noticed inconsistencies, the students' belongings left behind, the lack of any communication with friends or extended family, the suspicious timing of various institutional actions planned for that day. "Something about this stinks," he confided to his partner during one of their final interviews with Margaret. 15 kids don't just vanish into thin air, and that woman knows more than she's saying. But without evidence, without witnesses, without any leads that didn't evaporate under scrutiny, the case grew cold. The families eventually stopped calling. The media moved on to fresher tragedies, and Roosevelt High installed new security measures to prevent future incidents. Only Margaret carried the truth, and she guarded it like a sacred trust. Years of silence. For 29 years, Margaret lived with her secret. She left teaching, unable to bear the weight of standing in front of other people's children while carrying such enormous guilt and love. She moved across the country, took a job as a librarian in a small town where nobody knew her history. But she never stopped watching over her 15 children. Through her network, she received regular updates disguised as random correspondence. A Christmas card from Portland showing Danny, now David, graduating from college with a degree in social work. A newspaper clipping about Sarah, now Emma, being accepted to medical school. Photos of Marcus, now Michael, opening his own free clinic in Detroit. She watched them heal, grow, thrive, and become the people they were always meant to be. She saw them break the cycles of abuse and neglect that would have consumed them. Danny became an advocate for domestic violence survivors. Sarah specialized in treating traumatized children. Marcus provided free health care to the forgotten and abandoned. They all found love, real love, healthy love, the kind that builds rather than destroys. They had children of their own and raised them with the fierce protection of those who knew what it meant to be vulnerable. They became teachers, healers, advocates, parents, friends. They became whole, but Margaret also watched from afar as their biological families suffered. Parents who lost children to their own cruelty and indifference. Siblings left behind to navigate the same toxic environments alone. Communities that never learned to recognize and address the systematic abuse of their most vulnerable members. The guilt was crushing some days. Had she had the right to make such a choice? To play God with 15 lives? To rob families of their children, even if those families were destroying them? But then she'd receive another update. Tommy and Tyler becoming firefighters, dedicating their lives to saving others. Jessica earning her PhD in psychology and opening a treatment center for sexual abuse survivors. Kevin becoming a high school counselor who specialized in suicide prevention. The answer was always the same. Yes, she'd had the right. Not legally, perhaps, but morally. Love had given her the right, and love had been vindicated by the results, the diagnosis. The cancer diagnosis came 6 months ago. Aggressive, advanced, terminal. Margaret had perhaps 6 months to live, maybe less. At 78, she'd made peace with her mortality long ago, but she couldn't make peace with taking this secret to her grave. Her 15 children deserved to know the truth about their own courage, their own worth, their own survival. The world deserved to understand what had really happened in that detention room and why. She contacted David Park through an intermediary, a young journalist with a reputation for treating sensitive stories with intelligence and compassion. Someone who reminded her, achingly, of what Danny might have become if he'd been allowed to pursue journalism instead of merely surviving. Present day, the confession. They didn't just survive, Margaret told David, spreading photographs across the diner table like tarot cards revealing destiny. They thrived. Every single one of them became exactly what the world told them was impossible. Whole, healthy, successful, loved. The photos showed graduation ceremonies, weddings, children playing in sunny backyards, professional achievements, moments of pure joy that would have been impossible in their original circumstances. Danny, David, runs a non-profit in Portland now. Same work Rachel Morrison does, helping kids who fall through the cracks. He married a teacher named Lisa, has 3 kids of his own. Never raises his voice, never lifts a hand in anger. Broke the cycle completely. She showed him Sarah's medical degree, newspaper articles about her pioneering work in pediatric trauma surgery. Emma's saved hundreds of children, kids just like she was, broken, scared, written off by everyone else. She gives them what someone gave her, a chance to heal on. Marcus's clinic in Detroit had become legendary in the community. Free health care for anyone who needed it. No questions asked, no judgment rendered. Michael remembers what it feels like to be invisible, disposable. He makes sure no one else has to feel that way. One by one, she revealed their transformed lives. Amy's daughter Isabella, now a teacher herself, working in underserved communities. The twins, Tommy and Tyler, who'd found brotherhood in their fire department and saved countless lives. Jessica, whose treatment center had helped thousands of abuse survivors reclaim their power. But the families, David began. What families? Margaret's voice turned sharp. You mean the father who beat his son? The parents who drove their daughter to self-harm? The mother who chose drugs over her children? The stepfather who... She stopped, took a breath. Some families destroy. These children found real families, people who chose to love them unconditionally. David studied the evidence spread before him. Documentation spanning 3 decades, proof of 15 lives transformed by a single act of extraordinary love and courage. What about the law? What about the consequences? Margaret smiled sadly. I'm dying, David. Cancer. Maybe 3 months left, probably less. Prison doesn't frighten me. What frightens me is the possibility that people will think those children were criminals who deserved what happened to them. They were victims who deserved so much better. She pulled out one final document, a letter signed by all 15 of her former students, now adults with children of their own. They know, she said simply. I contacted them 6 months ago, when I got the diagnosis, told them everything, and they want the world to know too. The letter. David read the letter aloud, his voice breaking with emotion. To the world that wrote us off, we were 15 children sentenced to destruction by circumstances beyond our control. We were labeled, dismissed, abandoned by systems designed to protect us. We were told we had no future, no value, no hope. Margaret Chen proved them wrong. She didn't kidnap us. She saved us. She didn't enable our destruction. She made our healing possible. She gave us something no one else was willing to give, a chance. We became doctors, teachers, firefighters, social workers, parents, advocates. We broke cycles of abuse and neglect that had persisted for generations. We found love, created families, contributed to our communities, made the world better. None of this would have been possible without her courage to choose love over law, compassion over compliance. We are not victims of Margaret Chen. We are products of her love. We are proof that the thrown-away children of this world deserve chances, deserve families, deserve futures. Our biological families lost us the day they chose cruelty over kindness. Our real family, the one Margaret helped us find, has lasted nearly 3 decades. We regret nothing. We forgive everything. We love her everything. The world failed us. Margaret Chen saved us. That is the truth we want remembered. Signed, Tete, the class of 1995, all 15. The ripple effect. Margaret finished her coffee and prepared to leave, her confession complete. The weight she'd carried for 29 years was finally lifting, replaced by something she hadn't felt in decades, peace. "What happens now?" David asked. "Now I face whatever consequences come. Legal, social, personal, it doesn't matter. Those children lived, loved, thrived, and made the world better. That's worth any price." She stood slowly, her body betraying the toll of both cancer and decades of carrying such an enormous secret. "Will you tell their story?" she asked. The real story, not the sensationalized version about the mysterious disappearance, but the truth about 15 children who were dying in plain sight until someone finally saw them. David nodded, already composing the article in his mind. This wasn't just a true crime story. It was a love story, a redemption story. A story about the power of one person to change 15 lives and, through them, the world. "One more thing," Margaret said, pausing at the door. "When you write this, remember that they saved themselves. I just opened the door. Their courage, their resilience, their capacity for healing and love that came from them. They were never broken. They were just temporarily misplaced." As she walked away, Margaret felt lighter than she had in 3 decades. Behind her, David opened his laptop and began to type. The greatest crime of October 13th, 1995, wasn't the disappearance of 15 students from Roosevelt High School's detention room. It was the systematic failure of every adult and institution in their lives before Margaret Chen decided to break the law in service of a higher justice. The story would shock the nation when it was published 3 weeks later. It would spark debates about mandatory reporting, institutional reform, the definition of family, and the difference between legality and morality. It would inspire legislation, prompt investigations, and force uncomfortable conversations about how society treats its most vulnerable children. But for Margaret Chen, spending her final weeks in a hospital bed surrounded by flowers and letters from around the world, there was only the deep satisfaction of knowing that love, complicated, illegal, transformative love, had won. Her 15 children were safe, they were whole, they were loved, and that, in the end, was the only truth that mattered. Epilogue. 1 year later. The charges against Margaret Chen were quietly dropped after her death. The prosecutor cited compelling mitigating circumstances and extraordinary public interest in compassionate justice reform. Her funeral was attended by 15 middle-aged adults and their families, doctors, teachers, firefighters, social workers, parents, and advocates who had once been written off as hopeless. They buried her with the love and gratitude of hundreds of lives she'd touched, directly and indirectly, through her single act of extraordinary courage. David Park's article won a Pulitzer Prize and inspired a documentary that changed the public policy around child welfare and institutional accountability. Margaret's story became a case study in schools of social work, criminal justice, and education. But perhaps most importantly, it became a beacon of hope for other broken children and the adults who love them enough to break rules, challenge systems, and choose love over law when law fails love. The 15 children of Roosevelt High's detention class continued to thrive, their children and grandchildren carrying forward the legacy of love, healing, and second chances that Margaret Chen had made possible. In the end, 15 lives had been saved by one woman's refusal to accept that some children are disposable. And through those 15 lives, the world itself had been made a little more just, a little more compassionate, a little more willing to see the humanity in its most forgotten members. That was Margaret Chen's real crime and her greatest gift to the world.